Hello everyone, welcome to today's Orbit Live event. We're thrilled to be bringing together N.K. Jemisin and Claire North for today's event. N.K. Jemisin is the three-time Hugo Award-winning author of the Broken Earth trilogy, and most recently the New York Times best-selling novel The City We Became, which is out in paperback later this month. Claire North is the World Fantasy Award-winning author of many novels, including Notes from the Burning Age, which is also out later this month. Jemisin and North will be discussing their novels and other topics, and later in the event, they'll be answering your questions. If you'd like to ask a question, click on the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen and enter your question there. You can also vote on other attendees' questions so we know which are the most popular, and the authors can answer those first. To buy The City We Became or Notes from the Burning Age, click on the green button at the bottom of your screen that says Buy the Author's Books. And if you'd like to be notified about upcoming Orbit Live events, follow us on Crowdcast by clicking where it says Orbit Live at the top of your screen, and then clicking on the green Follow button. Now it is my pleasure to turn things over to N.K. Jemisin and Claire North.
Wow. All right. That was a great intro. Hi.
Hi. Thank you, Ellen, the magic voice behind the scenes.
Yes. Thank you, Ellen.
Just need that everywhere we go in our lives forever. Just walk into the shop. Welcome to buying a loaf of bread. That'd be incredible.
I think it would be nice. Yes. Well, I'm just going to start this off with like extreme fangirling because, and I've done this to you already behind the scenes, but I cannot help myself. You are one of my absolute favorite authors. Like the way that I was introduced to your work was that my previous editor, Davy Pillay, handed me a copy of A Madness of Angels. I mean, I was like, well, I'm super busy right now. You know, I don't know if I'll have time to get to this. Also, you know, what is this about? This I don't know anything about London. I don't need to read about magical London. And then I read about maybe 5 pages into it to when the trash monster, I think the trash monster was not able to chase Matthew into the metro, not metro. What is it called? The tube?
The tube.
Because he read the text on the back of his Oyster card as a protective spell. And at that point I was like, what is this? And I fell in love. So I'm a raging fan of yours. I have since read everything you've written. I'm still working on this, sadly, because life is ridiculous right now. And I don't have my much beloved copy of A Madness of Angels because I loaned it out to a friend who hasn't given it back. I know I have book stealing friends, but all that said, so I am a raging fan of yours. You have incredible skill with prose. I am in nothing but awe. Sometimes I read your stuff and it's just breathtaking. So, okay, I'll stop.
I might cry. Thank you.
Don't cry.
Thank you so much. I am very excited and grateful. Before this entire thing turns into a love fest, I am going to say that I have literally all of your books piled next to me right now. This one got taken out because I was also using some to kind of try and work out the height at which to put this thing for the camera.
Oh my god!
I was like trying to stack my books and other people's books to get the perfect height. So I have a slightly eclectic mix on the side, and I loved it. And if we're talking about like chases through the underground, minor spoiler, the King Kong moment in The City We Became was a proper punch the air, kind of delightful glee.
Oh my god.
And I loved reading the book. It has been really hard to read throughout this year, I think, because the pandemic, everything has just been so overwhelming. But I went and sat by the sea for a week, and The City We Became was just this joyful, perfect, but also so rich and complicated. It had the wonder and the pain and the excitement, and it kind of captured so much about everything I love about cities, about kind of the complexity of the fact that all this pain and hatred exists all at the same time as this wonder and this interconnectedness and this love, and you can't have one without the other, and it all tangles up. But it captured it with so much fun and so much actual beauty. Like the conceptualization of the power of city as magic was just it was thrilling. And actually, as we're here waffling, I did want to kind of ask you about the use of fantasy to do that, because particularly I think in urban fantasy there's a real beauty and a real art in being able to tell stories about the real, but in a way that just escalates it and elevates it, so that you're experiencing something profoundly important and real in the present day, but also you're experiencing a story that makes you want to punch the air and go, King Kong!
Well, I mean, this is my first dip into writing in the real world. And I found that it's a lot harder than writing in secondary worlds. You have a lot more experience with that than I do, both doing like sort of science fictional flavored stuff and fantasy stuff. But, I think you're completely right about, the urban fantasy. The power of urban fantasy is in capturing those weird sort of numinous moments when you're in a place and you just suddenly feel like there's more to it than just what you're seeing. And I think you're 100% right to kind of peg that as a different way to engage with the drama and the stress and the trauma of what we're dealing with right now in the world. And I ended up kind of writing with the city City We Became. Wow, I forgot the name of my own book for a second. But with the City We Became, I kind of ended up writing through a lot of my own sort of complex emotions about New York. When you live in a city long enough, you end up loving it and hating it. But then even when you have those hate moments, you still feel bound to it. It's still part of your identity, and then you need to protect it because it's part of what makes you feel whole and healthy. And that's not always possible when you're dealing with a metropolis of several million people.
I think we were talking about this a little bit beforehand. When I was reading City Became, you referenced London. You're like, oh, London's birth was very traumatic. And I sat there going, as a Londoner, I was just like, but my city, my
oh no.
I was just like, and it was a proper moment of pure tribalism. And I think there is something you see a lot in city dwellers where they're like, I can say that London is terrible. I am absolutely allowed to beat down on my city, but no one else comes near it. No one else gets to say this about my precious home. And it's like, I think that's actually something else really interesting that's captured in the book, like this real sense of the tribes, the boroughs, not just incorporating the city, but incorporating this sense of belonging that is both hugely expansive but incredibly introverted. And it's this, I just thought it was this beautiful kind of way of capturing that dichotomy, that really human experience of holding these two things simultaneously. And I think that's something as well that's really interesting about your writing about a lot of the kind of more modern fantasy and the urban fantasy, is it is more willing to hold these two things simultaneously. And I really enjoyed as well how the book kind of sort of lent into kind of that Lovecraftian tentacle thing, while also simultaneously gorgeously demolishing Lovecraft. Like it's got this fabulous many things all at the same time, and the fact that it allows you to hold that without punching in the face with it is gorgeous.
Yeah. I have to admit that I had not read a lot of Lovecraft before that whole fracas with the World Fantasy Awards a few years ago. And then I went to go and read like several pieces of it, but there was one in particular, which is the short story, The Horror at Red Hook. And any modern New Yorker is like, Red Hook is where IKEA is. That's really all we, unless you live in Red Hook, in which case, then it's part of your identity and you want to defend it and you want to fight me for saying Red Hook is nothing but IKEA. But then what it kind of drove home to me is that Lovecraft was feeling that same identification too. He was feeling that same sense of personality, of kind of awareness that there is a presence or a life to an area of the city. It's just that he hated and feared that life. And that was really kind of the impetus of the book for me, is like, he looks at the city and he sees horrors. I look at the city and I see wonders and a few horrors. So it's really just a matter of like, what can we do to sort of bring that up? And you do raise a good point about that being a change in urban fantasy lately, I think. I've read a lot of urban fantasy, or I used to kind of back a few years ago. I read a lot of urban fantasy that was set in a particular city, but did not seem to actually engage with that city's identity. I'm not going to name names of the particular fantasy works, but these are big, well-known cities, and sometimes the authors were getting like the general, like the tenor of like where different groups of people lived, because almost all cities have various segregations and neighborhoods and things like that. They were getting the neighborhoods wrong. They were getting the culture wrong. They were getting the food wrong. And I'm like, you live in this city and you didn't just like, go look, how are you getting this wrong? Now, that said, then I turned around and got something wrong. There are lots of people in New York who really pissed at me right now because I mentioned that Rockaway Parkway was in Brooklyn and not Queens. And the horror. But, all things considered, I am very sorry, fellow New Yorkers. I could have done that a lot better. I should have checked. I have friends from the Rockaways who are mad at me right now. It's not even funny. But anyway, that said, I have told you also that I came to London a few years ago and did like my own personal The Matthew Swift tour. Thank you. You made my London trip a lot more interesting than it could have been.
Thank you. I can't wait to go back to New York and do the proper City We Became tour.
If you come to visit, let me know. I will show you around. I will also leave you alone if you prefer.
I sort of feel like I need to visit Staten Island now, though. Almost, I in a way, I'm that part of the story is so dark in so many ways, but it was also such an interesting kind of almost a look at how the stories we tell change everything about who we are. And it's always that thing, isn't it, where you're trying to talk to someone and go, by the way, are you aware that you're being a horrendous bigot? And what people hear is not the stories that you're telling yourself horrendously bigoted. What people hear is, you're telling me my fear isn't real, you're telling me my soul isn't real.
Yeah.
And the way you kind of capture that in Staten Island, I find, and it never occurred to me to visit Staten Island, which is almost the point of your book. And now I feel I sort of must.
Staten Island is great. It has a lot of really amazing places. It's got beaches everywhere. It's got farms. In the middle of New York City, there are farms. Yeah. That's not just Staten Island. There's like, if you're driving through Brooklyn on the way to JFK, there's like a horse paddock along the way. Like, New York is a strange place. Oh no, I was just going to say that is what I wanted to get across, is that people come to New York and their impression of it is shaped by Times Square. Go to the boroughs. If you ever want to really see the city, go out into the boroughs, the outer boroughs, as they say. Manhattan is a borough too. Anyway.
It is. So. It's, I think that in many ways, the ability of a city to surprise is what lends itself so well to fantasy. We have inner city farms in London, and they have llamas on them. And you put a detail like that into a story, and it will either kind of jerk someone out of that wall and make them go, what? No, I'm reading a book, instead of immersed in experience. Or it's that little bit of truth, that little bit of detail, I think, which really draws you in. I think I don't know how you found it, I think there's a real craft in being able to choose what's the detail that makes this sing and makes it come alive, as compared to what's the detail that make people go, I'm reading a book, this is murder, I need to go and Google that.
I was actually really sad that I didn't see any foxes while I was in London. Just because you had written so much about, like, it was just a tiny little detail that made it feel real and not magical to me, even as you're writing about all these incredible magical events happening. And that to me that's the home team advantage. I should never use sports ball metaphors. I don't know anything about it. But it's those little details that I think are part of what creates the identity that we're talking about. I started to make the point that, like, there was a trend in urban fantasy for a while where you would mention the city, but you didn't actually get into the city as part of the character, as one of the characters of the story. And your book was the first one that I had read in a while. There have been some famous ones that have done that very well, but your book was the first one that I had read in quite some time that had done it, which signaled to me that you were moving away from that trend of the city as just background. So that's one of the things I actually really love seeing and wanted to see more of. And when I read your books, I did not immediately think I want to write something similar. I wasn't remotely even thinking that, but then when I started, of course, working on it, I was like, oh my God, am I like biting off of her? But yeah, no, I probably am. But it's meant to be a positive homage.
I know I'm just gushing, but that first chapter, the first actual battle, the way the city itself is a tool in that battle just blew my mind. And it's not just your standard fantasy, I shoot lightning out of my fingertips. The city itself, as I think it really captured the essence of the word life, because we always talk about living in these kind of scientific terms, these abstract terms, but like for life to be so magnificently big. And I think that's something, again, that science fiction and fantasy really excels at, capturing of bigness. And actually, I think it's something you've done in all your books. Like Broken Earth is obviously the most famous for it in terms of capturing something enormous while also making it a human experience, which again, I think is something that Fantasy SF does really well. And it does very well, both in terms of capturing a fictional story and making that huge, but it also captures, I think, is an interesting tool for capturing these really big ideas and these big conversations were happening, and making it both this very human experience of a scruffy kid trying to get food, while also making it a living, enormous thing. I think that's kind of part of the power of the tool, and it's a pity that more people don't turn around and go, wow, there's so much bigness encapsulated so well with this craft.
Yeah. Well, I mean, speaking of bigness, it occurs to me we should actually talk about your current novel as well. Or do you want? I was trying to do a better segue. I'm sorry, I'm not good at segues. But so you've decided to go post-apocalyptic, I see. So a little post-apocalypse in the morning. So what made you decide that you wanted to go this route with your latest book? Once again, called Notes from the Burning Age.
So I have a friend who gets all the credit for this. I'm not going to pretend that I'm any way original about this. I have a friend who works for the World Wildlife Foundation, not to be confused with the wrestling people, who has complained for a very long time, correctly.
I didn't even think about that, but you're right. Oh my God.
It's a real problem.
Okay.
She complains correctly that when we talk about environmentalism and climate change, most of the narratives are there's going to be a disaster and we're going to end up eating dog meat in our grandmothers. And I think that's right. I think when you think of a lot of kind of novels about environmentalism and climate change, that is the story that's told. It's told of everything's gone wrong, everything's on fire, you're now living in Mad Max. But the problem is that as stories go, this has two big problems. Firstly, it doesn't motivate anyone to act. Fear is a much less powerful motivator than hope. And the history of all civic actions, I think, all social movements, shows that it's very rare that you fight against something. You fight for something. You fight for a dream of something better, and that's how you produce real and lasting change. At least that's how you produce real and lasting change without murdering everyone in the manner of the Soviet Union.
Right.
So the fact that our stories are so despondent and despairing is genuinely a cultural problem for how we combat climate change. And she was like, it's a real frustration to me that culture is not getting on board with maybe we don't have to eat our grandmothers. And so she was like, have you ever considered writing something utopian? And the answer was no, but I've been on a roll of really flipping miserable books lately. So yeah, I would love to write something post-apocalyptic utopian. So it's my best stab at essentially trying to talk about climate change and environmentalism from the point of view of it's not a disaster. We can act, and we can act not merely economically and politically to create a better world. We can act socially and culturally to create a better world. We can, through kind of trying to find harmony with nature, attempt to find harmony with each other, but also we have the technologies already. We know what needs to be done. We know the lifestyle change we need to make, and it's not hard.
What we lack is the will. Yeah.
All we lack is the will. And I think what's interesting, I'm going to tie this all up in a neat little bow, which was not my intention, but it's happening.
You don't have to, you can just ramble if you want. That's fine.
I think there's a certain truth about this. I think what's really interesting about what you're writing as well is that writers don't necessarily have that kind of cultural responsibility to write pompous books and didactic, but we do have a duty to our cultures and to changing the stories and to putting forward new and different stories. And so I was kind of like, actually, there is a really valid argument to trying to put forward more positive stories about climate change. I think Kim Stanley Robinson is currently nailing that. I haven't actually read his latest, but like really kind of going hard in on let's change the narrative, let's look to hope. The Ministry
2312?
The Ministry of the Future is the latest one.
Oh, okay, I haven't read that.
But when you still think of stories, it's the road, it's despondent, it's your risk stories, and changing that narrative. I think is actually a very important part of how we try and change the conversations, hopefully while also having fun. Hopefully also having a rip-roaring adventure full of thrillers and spies.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a laziness at the core of a lot of the just utterly pessimistic post-apocalyptic or apocalyptic fiction out there. There's a sense of, well, we're screwing it up. There's going to be a point of no return past which things will change horrifically forever, and we just give up at that point. We just stop. And it's so pervasive in science fiction and fantasy. Like even I was trying to play Fallout, Fallout 4, I think. I'm sorry, this is the point where we segue into gaming. I'm so sorry.
But Fallout 4.
Oh, okay. Well, I did not love Fallout 4, and I tried very hard because I love Skyrim, and I'm like, okay, this is Skyrim but uglier. So I start trying to play Fallout, and the thing that keeps hitting me in the face is it's been hundreds of years since the massive nuclear war that's destroyed this world, and nobody has tried to really rebuild. Nobody's cleaning up. There's still rusty cars everywhere. Nobody moved them. Like, why are you people just living in this detritus of this world that ruined the world? Why don't you try something new now? And it just didn't, like, everybody was living in, kind of shantytown looking places with scrap metal walls and things like that. And I'm like, in 200 years, none of you thought to like cut down some trees, which is not necessarily a good thing to do. But none of you thought to like try building a new place or something. And it's just this assumption that, okay, well, we can't fix it. We can't do anything about it. We might as well prepare to eat our grandmothers, like you said. And that's just, how are you supposed to fix things if you can't even imagine that they are fixable? So yeah, I mean, I have 100% agreement with you on that.
Ironically, that's what I enjoyed about Fallout 4, because I was the one building the settlements. I had no interest in the game, but if you wanted me to build your shiny, cleaned up settlement, oh yes, I'll give you fresh running water. But I think that, again, that's what's interesting about that, is that fiction of itself for thousands of years has been the hero narrative. And what a lot of dystopian post-apocalyptic stories lean into is your happy ending is the hero. There's one person who comes out of the desert and makes it all better. And while that's a lovely, comforting story, it's also in many ways a quite dangerous story that has often been weaponized, I think, in our culture against us. And the reality is that utopia, and indeed the function of cities, the function of big organic objects like society, like cities, require collective action. But collective action it's difficult to spin a
socialism
story. Not socialism. But
oh my god, the horror. Yeah,
I think I don't know if you've got it, but I've certainly got the editorial note going, can we have a focused character with agency rather than people who are swept off by events that are going on? Can we really zoom in on the emotional heart of this one individual? And that's great, and that's important, because that is a hook, and there's craft in hooking into that craft. But at the same time, dystopia loves a savior. And as a society, I think we're a bit in love with saviors.
Yeah, too much.
And that's a problem.
Right. We're waiting on a savior to come along and fix all of this when the savior is us. But, we see this tension everywhere in our society. I'm sorry. I just noticed there's a cat hair on your face. Okay. But anyway, so sorry. So we have this tension everywhere in society, this resistance to the idea that problems that are systemic can need to be solved in systemic ways. That, you can't just suddenly have one person come along who's a miracle worker who just makes everything better. And a large part of that resistance is because in a lot of cases, the powers that be are people who are benefiting from the way that the situation is right now. They don't want it to change. And so, they're the ones who keep kind of pushing back on the idea that, if we want to get rid of bigotry, if we want to get rid of, sort of environmentally harmful practices, if we want to, fix the world, basically, the idea that you can fix the world is treated as a threat. And, or as childish, pie in the sky. How dare you believe that we can be better? And it's just, there's something really wrong with that, to the degree that I'm not sure what to think about it, and I'm not sure who to blame for that. It feels to me like there is almost a driving will behind this resistance to the idea that we can be better. And it's not just I guess, you don't want to assume that there's a conspiracy when it's actually probably just a bunch of people being selfish and foolish. But I am starting to wonder if there's some kind of conspiracy at work, because it's such a consistent objection, and I don't know how to kind of address that. And we are at 2:30, and I see that we've got 13 questions. I'm going to stop talking, but please continue if you wanted to add something to what I was saying.
I think we should answer some questions.
Oh, well, all right then. All right. A reminder to people who, I see there are folks in the chat who are talking about it, but just a reminder that at the bottom of the screen, you'll see an ask a question thingy. So please put your questions there. And if you don't have a question, you can also upvote other people's questions so that we will end up with, kind of a nice order of what order to ask the questions in. And we may not be able to get all of them, but we can at least get to the ones that most of you really want. So how do you want to do this, Kat? You want to trade off asking and answering, or what?
I think there are a lot of questions to both of us. So
I see.
I'll read out the top one.
Okay.
Because it's been upvoted.
Oh, it just moved. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, EB. Let's see. Beyond your home cities of New York and London, what other city would you like to set a novel in?
You want to take that first, or me?
I was going to say I really want to write a book set in New York, but that seems laughable at this point.
No, New York is big enough to accommodate many, many stories, just like London. So please come visit New York, right? Right.
I will take, however, Istanbul as my backup, because Istanbul is a truly astonishing city.
Oh, I've never been. I've always wanted to visit. All right. Well, at some point I will visit Istanbul, and we will see if I also want to write a story in that. The only other city that I love enough that I would want to write about would be New Orleans. And I have written about New Orleans via short stories. But the problem is that the New Orleans I knew and loved 20 years ago does not exist anymore. Post-Hurricane Katrina, it is a post-apocalyptic New Orleans in some ways. And so I feel like if I were ever going to write about New Orleans, I would need to go back there and reacquaint myself with how it is now. But that's the only other city that I think I would love enough to want to do. I'm fascinated by Chicago, but I haven't lived there, and also Chicago doesn't like me. I will not once again tell the horrifying story of how Chicago almost killed me one winter. But no, it's a running joke that I tell my Chicago friends all the time. But I went to a career fair there. I was trying to get a job fresh out of grad school. I had an interview on the other side of the Chicago River. I was dressed in business clothes and a nice trench coat, and I decided to cross the Chicago River on a freezing cold day with not enough clothing on. And yeah, so I nearly collapsed and died. I nearly died. Chicago tried to kill me. Anyway.
I don't want to rain on Chicago too much, even though it's the rainy city. I've been in Chicago for a grand total of about 36 hours.
Oh,
and
wow.
while I was there, tornadoes struck. And I was the only person who didn't know what that sound was.
Oh, no!
I wonder what's happening. There seems to be this persistent siren sound. So there is a pattern merging here. Chicago
tries to kill people. Yep. Yep. All right. Well, all my Chicago friends are going to blow up my phone in about 5 minutes. But anyhow. All right. Next question. Let's see. The next question is from Laura Hoylan. My apologies if I mangled that. You both write novels with elements of science fiction and fantasy. Can we make a clear division between the two genres? Where can we draw the line, or there isn't really one?
After you.
I knew you were going to do that. I do not believe there is a line. I believe that the line between science fiction and fantasy, as rigidly enforced by the various gatekeepers within the genre and outside of it, that line is an artificial line that is maintained purely for pedantic reasons. The only reason it exists in the first place is because of marketing, so that books could be separated and sold more easily in a bookstore. And, I've talked about this in other interviews, but with the Broken Earth books, I was deliberately playing with what's called Clarke's Law, which is that any sufficiently advanced, am I getting it wrong? Okay. Any sufficiently advanced magic or complex, any sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic. My apologies. The coffee is now 4 hours gone in my bloodstream, and I can't think. And, there's also, and always has been, the corollary of that, which is that any sufficiently complexified magic is indistinguishable from science. So, why not just play with that and run with it? And, the division also has some... I'm possibly starting another controversy by saying this, but I think that there's a gendered component to it. When I was little, and this was in the 70s and 80s, early 80s, when I was little, fantasy had been successfully branded as feminine and science fiction as masculine. And, for a long time, since I was a kid who had a lot of issues that I had to work through, I didn't want to read fantasy because it was girl stuff, girly. And that's changed, and it's gotten better since then. But a lot of the pushback on fantasy, I feel like, is affiliated with a kind of gendering and energy affiliated with that. So I don't know, but that's my feeling on it.
I think, yeah, I basically agree with all of that.
Well, okay.
It was unhelpful. I know it's not very charismatic. I think it is changing in terms of the gendering. I think that there are kind of voices starting to emerge, like kind of Becky Chambers and Anne Leckie seizing kind of what we loosely call the harder end of science fiction. And there's been plenty of males always have to colonize everywhere. Take that with what you will. Yeah,
I mean, even the hard, soft distinction that you mentioned is sort of weirdly gendered in a way, and I don't know what's going on with that. Well, I know what's going on with that, but anyway.
Yeah, we could get very boys with their toys, but let's not.
That's also a completely different conversation. So we could spend a couple of hours on that one alone. And we have 14 questions. Oh my god. Okay. All right. Do you want to take the next one?
Okay. With TV movie adaptations in the pipeline, thoughts on dream casting?
Oh my god. God, people keep asking me that, and I'm like, I don't watch TV. I don't watch movies. Do you want to start?
My answer is going to be terrible because I am a theatre technician / lighting designer, and I therefore regard actors as nothing but three-dimensional objects occluded by light. Like, I have spent so many years spotting celebrities, lighting famous people, lighting lighting really famous people with an attitude of, why are you stood there? Why are you stood there? What are you doing there? And as a result, my attitude to actors is just like, it's almost my professional obligation to walk up to an A-lister and be like, wait, what? And so I just psychologically can't do it. It's like, say the words, dude. Say the words, stand in your light. I am the worst person at answering this question.
Okay. Well, I will take my little tired stab at it. I've seen a lot of really good fan casts out there, and the only thing that I guess has ever really, like, I've heard some fans suggest it, and then it was like instantly like ping, yes, okay, that's right, I agree with that, is the idea of Regina King as Essen for the Broken Earth series. And, I mean, that's a pie in the sky cast. Her star is blazing right now. She's super hot. There's no chance that anybody is going to convince her to do, another little science fiction thing when, she just did one in Watchmen. But that's the one fan cast that I think, if I had a dream cast, that she would be the one. All right. Okay, so next question. Did you read the last one? Okay, all right, I'll read the next one. We have 2 4-pointers. So I'm just going to pick the first one I see. You both write novels with big ideas in addition to a compelling plot. How do you go about balancing the two? Thank you, Travis.
I'll do a short pop at it, which is that when I was but a wee little child in my mummy's arms, she turned to me and said, now, young child, if you're going to write, rule 1 is put the story first, which sounds so glib, and everyone always says it, but it is important, because if if your ideas are something you wish to be didactic about, go be a journalist, go write an academic book. Your job is to tell a story. And also the fact of the matter is that if your ideas are big enough that they are consuming your brain and you're like, this is really, really important, it will come out regardless. You will write it and it will happen. So I don't make an active decision to balance two. I'm aware that my angry, didactic, left-wing, liberal, environmentalist soul is going to be spewed all over the pages, whether I mean it or not. My job is to tell you a story and hope for the best.
Yeah, I agree. People ask me all the time if my goal with writing is to send some message. And I'm like, well, the messages will be there regardless of whether I try to put them in there or not. I am who I am. I live the life that I live. That is the case with all fiction. All fiction is transmitting messages of some flavor or another. The question is just whether you notice them or not. And in a lot of cases, whether you notice them or not, it depends on how close they are to messages you're hearing from everywhere else in the culture or not, whether they are reinforcing the status quo or not. And at the end of the day, I just want to tell a good story. I just want people to enjoy the story that I'm reading. And enjoy has a lot of different definitions. They may read, I've warned people about reading the Broken Earth books, for example, if they have small children, because, probably not the best time to read a story that contains 2 child deaths. I will leave it at that. But I am reinforcing that warning to everybody because, sometimes when you read these things, you're going to come out of it feeling, really kind of terrible. But the goal is that you are engrossed in the story. You follow and care about the character. You want to see what happens. And if I've done that, then I've done my job.
I think what's interesting, just before doing the next question, just thinking about that, is that the other thing you have to remember is that you can write the biggest ideas you want in the most compelling way you will, and readers will still pick it up and they will absolutely see something that is unique to them in it. Again, short of spelling out in a journalistic manner, by the way, the point is X, all you can really do is convey humanity in its most complicated and its most authentic way you possibly can and hope for the best. And so you still know there's going to be readers who pick up on that and go, I see you're telling a story about sofas or whatever it is that matters to the reader at the time. There is a certain degree of powerlessness when it comes to big ideas as to who's going to take it and what they're going to do with that, I think.
I hope that you guys cannot hear noise. That's why I'm wearing my headset. I have some work being done on my house right now. So there are power tools in the background. But all right, let's see. Do you want to take the next question?
Yeah. Another one from Travis Tippins. Hello, Travis. You've both written stories where cities are living things. What were the most interesting challenges that came from that?
Do you want to start, or?
I think you should take this.
Oh, great! Of course. Probably the biggest challenge for me has been that I have to physically do things to really feel like I understand them. So you mentioned the sequence with King Kong in The City We Became. I spent months trying to get in to physically see Old City Hall Station in New York. It is a closed off station. You can visit it via the Transportation Museum, I think is what it's called. But you have to set that up in advance, and getting tickets to see this is like getting into a Beyonce concert. It's like they announce in advance that the tickets for the Old City Hall Station tours will be available on a particular day at a particular hour, and you need to be online 5 minutes ahead of time, clicking refresh every few seconds in order to get in. And I managed to get in once. And I caught the flu. And I'm like, okay, so how dedicated to my craft am I? Do I really want to infect a bunch of other people with what I've got? And I decided not to, because I was trying to be a responsible human being. But what that meant was that I never got a chance before the book went to the final stage of printing to actually physically see City Hall Station. So I did the best I could by researching the hell out of it and just kind of using my imagination. But it was frustrating to me because I was like, I don't know what it smells like. I need to know what the sounds are like. Does it sound creepy in there? I couldn't get that. And so, I felt like I did. I feel like I did a bad job with that scene. Maybe I'm the only person that feels that. Maybe I'm the only person that sees that. But it felt inauthentic, if that's a way of saying it. And so, now I'm traveling all over the city again, and I'm having the problem again, partly because of COVID. A lot of stuff is shut down in New York. And so I can't physically get in to see things that I really want to see. And it's just super frustrating. So that's it for me.
I'm going to ask a question to follow up, if that's all right. So that's a very kind of problem with that's experiencing the world's a tactile thing. But so many of your books are other worlds. They're kind of secondary versions of. So given kind of how tactile you need to be with New York, how do you approach writing other worlds that are not that?
Well, that's easy. I can just make that up. Nobody's gonna be like, City Hall Station doesn't smell like that, but, nobody's going to be like that with a fantasy world, because it doesn't exist. But with this world where so many people have engaged with these things, so many people have imbued this city with the energy and the identity I'm trying to talk about, I feel a need to get accurate with it. And sometimes I'm able to do that, and sometimes I'm not. There's going to be a few more fudgings in book 2 because stuff not open. So we'll see what happens. I'll do the best I can.
I find that really interesting. So when I write, on the very few occasions I've committed secondary worlds, I can picture it and I can imagine it because the world's my playground. But then I sit there going, am I actually communicating this correctly? It's much easier to communicate something that I've physically seen or can at least have a hook for and adapt from. Whereas if you've got this picture of another world in your head, trying to convey that in a way that doesn't just destroy meaning, I think there's a real art to it.
Yeah, I've found it so much easier to do a secondary role, and maybe it's just that I'm like incredibly pedantic. This is I'm aware of this is a problem for myself, but I latch on to the idea that I need to have experienced it in order to write about it if it's real, and maybe I don't. But that's how I am. So anyway,
that makes total sense.
Yeah.
There's some questions which I think are very specifically for you. So,
okay.
What went into the decision to interrupt the city-born great's end? That's quite a difficult thing to say. And write the city we became instead of writing a book from where it ended in another city. The interruption makes the book feel like a prequel.
Okay. Well, I mean, it was deliberate that I wanted the city-born great, the short story that I first wrote, I wanted it to be a prequel, basically. When I first wrote The City Born Great, I had, and I've talked about this in other interviews, but I have a tendency to write short stories that I'm kind of using as like a tester to see if I want to write a novel in that world. And if I do it right, then, the short story doesn't always have anything to do specifically with the novel that results. I kind of infamously wrote a short story called Stone Hunger, which was my tester for The Broken Earth. And it's like there's a character named Mika in it, and it's not the same Mika that you see in the novel version. But in this case, it just felt like I wanted to continue his story. So I just changed basically the last line of the whole short story and just ran with that. But I mean, the decision was just based on like after The Broken Earth, I was tired. That trilogy was emotionally draining on multiple levels, and I had probably also emotionally drained myself because I was dealing with a lot of personal and family stuff at that time. And I wanted to write something lighthearted. And I'd always wanted to know more about the protagonist's story. I will spoil this. The protagonist and it's not really a huge spoiler. The protagonist in The City We Became and The City Born Great isn't named. And he is the character that becomes the embodiment of New York. Sorry, that was cat hair again. Anyway, he's the character that becomes the embodiment of New York, and nobody knows his name. He starts calling himself Neek, as in the phonetic pronunciation of NYC. So anyway, I wanted to know more about Neek's story, and that was really all that came down to was I had a vague idea of why don't we write a story where, the city of New York, like a giant robot, fights Cthulhu, And let's go with this story and let's turn that into that. That was it.
Nice.
You're right. These are very specific questions. Okay. Let's skip to one that is, this looks good. I remember seeing an article about a year ago about a Harry August movie. Whoops. Wait. Question moved. Here it is. Okay. Found it. About a Harry August movie. Will it actually happen? From Dylan.
I mean,
from your mouth to Hollywood's ears.
Me. So the film process, I don't know if this has been your experience of it, but the film process goes something like this. Someone options your book and you get a phone call quite early on going, oh my God, I'm not going to do the accent, it's terrible. I loved everything about your novel. I was so
Please do the accent.
You don't have
to.
It was so moving. And what we need you to be a really important part of this process. Like, you are integral to this. You are the source. I'm like, ketchup or HP, but you are the source. And we're going to keep you in touch with everything that happens.
We'll have your people call our people and we'll get together.
Yeah, exactly. And then everything goes silent for about 15 months. And then at the end of that 15 months, you get a phone call going, oh my God, Claire, Cat, whatever your name is, it's made such good progress. We had a screenwriter, but then we lost the screenwriter, but then we acquired a different screenwriter, but then we lost that screenwriter. But we've been talking to a director who knows someone who might be interested, and it's just going so well, and we need to renew. And if you're lucky, you might get a free lunch out of it, which is amazing. And then that process kind of repeats ad infinitum. And it does vary a lot from option to option, producer to producer. And I'm very lucky because the ones in Harry August have actually been very good about keeping me in touch. And it's now slated to be directed by the amazing Wes Ball. So fingers crossed. But generally speaking, your role as the author is to be informed how important your creative input is.
And then ignored otherwise.
Yeah, which I believe is very different because you're actually adapting your own work. Is that right?
For this latest deal, yes. And that was just so the latest deal, for those that haven't heard, the Broken Earth trilogy was originally sold to optioned by TNT that was going to make it into a TV series. Then there was a long period of silence, the 15 months of nothing. Then some other things happened that I can't talk about because they were never announced by the studios involved. But there were some turnovers. And then finally the option rights released back to me, and my film agent was like, well, why don't we've had lots of people querying about a possible movie deal. Why don't we see what happens? And that, like, as part of that, they were like, well, we know that, you're not going to have time to be involved in this. And I was like, well, maybe I might be able to work that in, I mean, at some point soon, I'm going to hopefully be done with the city's stuff. And they were like, well, we know that you don't want to write the screenplay. And I was like, I actually would love to try my hand at screenplay writing. I'm probably not going to be very good at it because I've never done it, but I just did a comic book and I didn't know what the hell I was doing there either. So, this seems to be my particular modus operandi is, I'm interested in a thing and then people are like, here, we'll throw money at you to do it for real, first time out of the gate. And I'm like, oh God. And then I do it. And I don't know whether it's good, but, I managed to do it. So that's how that kind of happened. But, I agree 100% with your characterization of how this works. You get phone calls from very enthusiastic people and then long periods of silence where you don't know what the hell is going on. And then checks show up. That part's nice. So we will see what happens. I would love to see the Harry August movie, though. I can't wait to, I hope that it comes together.
Of all the things I have under option, it's the one which I think is most likely to happen. So fingers crossed. Again, I do not permit myself to get excited because Hollywood. And also people are like, who's going to play the parts? I'm like, actors. But it's I think we've actually had quite a similar 2 years in a way, because I also got the phone call kind of going, Kat, would you like to write your own stuff? And I was like, I have no skill in this regard. I have no experience, I have no craft, and I think there's a real problem when authors are like, of course, I will adapt my own novel, it'll be brilliant. Because actually there's a real craft in being able to transcend the mediums to be able to get from one medium to the other. You have to be willing to let it go of a lot. And the only real advantage I can tell from hiring me as my own scriptwriter is that I've been able to turn to producers and go, this isn't on Harry August, by the way, but please don't ask me what it is because I have to not tell. But anyway, the only advantage I can have hiring me is my willingness to be able to turn around and go, well, that doesn't work, that doesn't work, that doesn't work. We should definitely cut that, which I think in many ways lots of script writers are not allowed to do. There's a kind of, the sanctity of the text. Whereas in a way I feel like I have the privilege of being able to go, the sanctity of the text worked as text. It does not work as film or movie. And I give you my blessing to literally delete to make it work. But that is, it's a very different emotional experience, I think, that it's a very different thing of kind of having to reassess your own work and go, well, how would this work in a completely different storytelling medium?
I would not be able to do the script writing for the Great Cities stuff. It's too fresh. I care about it. I'm emotionally bound to it. But, I think a lot of people don't remember that, I started the Broken Earth series in like 2012 or 2013. The first book came out in 2015. So, I finished that book in 2014. Like, it's been years. I'm not feeling emotionally attached to it anymore. Now I'm like, oh, let's cut this character. Let's, that don't make no sense. Whatever. I feel like I can do it for that or for an older piece. I cannot do it for anything that I genuinely love. Right now, I'm like very, very attached to the broken whatever cities, to the Great Cities, and so that's it's difficult. Even with that detachment, though, I'm finding the medium is so different, and I'm not a naturally visual person. So what I'm really doing right now is just watching a bunch of movies that I love and, stealing ideas for like angles and approaches and methods. And I guess that's what everybody does. I hope that's what everybody does. Well, no, most people go to film school, but, I got to be hard about it. Anyway. Oh my gosh, we have more questions? How is this happening? Where are these coming from? You guys like breeding these questions? Oh, well, here's a good one for you. Dang, I didn't know you wrote under another pseudonym than Claire North. Now I have to look for Kate Griffin. Any other names I should look for? And why did you switch around, says Daniel, putting you completely on the spot.
Thank you. But also, thank you. I used to write as Catherine Webb, which is the real me, but I was 14 when that happened. So unless you're a teenage child who doesn't get out of the house much, you may not. It might not. There were 8 of them, I think. The last 4 are kind of fun, like they're Victorian steampunky rompy, but they're very YA because I was a child.
You wrote YA while being a YA. That is not a thing that normally happens.
Didn't get out the house much, but that's also part of the answer question of why I switched around. Like, I got to the age of 19, 20 and started writing adult fantasy, which is not to be confused with vampire porn. And my publisher was like, we need to have a name change to sort of put this is a restricted viewing certificate on this book. And also at the time, there was something called bookshops, which, blimey, I miss bookshops. And the W letter of the alphabet is literally right at the very bottom shelf next to the vampire porn. When you went in, they're like, could you have a surname that puts you much higher up in the ranking? Could you, in fact, put yourself next to Neil Gaiman so that when people try and buy a copy of Neverwhere and it's out of stock...
Was that the idea? Okay, all right.
Orbit UK for the win! And a very similar thing happened with Claire North. They were like, well, you're now writing literature.
And thrillers, too.
Yeah, and we need to pretend that you're not a science fiction fantasy writer because of the inherent snobbery of the industry and the inherent snobbery of criticism and all of that jazz. And so when people go to buy a book by David Mitchell and their eye just sort of drifts downwards, just need to be able to find you right there. So it's marketing. It's a marketing ploy. It's a combination of aging and marketing.
Okay. I've heard of that process happening with other authors, but usually it was, kind of done as a after the fact thing when something bad had happened to them within the industry. But doing it preemptively, as you've done, just sounds like almost like franchising. I don't know if that makes sense, but
it completely makes sense. And I think part of it is also that when you're a young writer, the product being sold is as much the novelty of your youth as it is the actual words you're writing. And in a way, I think you invest a lot of energy. Certainly as a publisher, I think you have to invest a lot of energy in here's this child, isn't that interesting? And to kind of, there is, for want of a better word, a brand that gets built with that. And a part of a publisher's job is to build a brand, is to build kind of a language of when you pick up this book, you know roughly what you're going to be expecting. Even if the story and the theme changes, there's going to be ideas, there's going to be quirks of voice that you can rely on. And I think that's a very important part of what publishers do, to be honest. It's not dissimilar from, we have genre so we can find the books we like. There is a thematic vibe, even over 20-something years. There's an interesting thing happening in publishing right now. Just to divert for a second, where a lot of people are being asked to use initialisms. So instead of being Catherine Webb, it would be C.L. Webb, which is very much about gender and will you judge this book by the gender of its author, and will you read that differently? And it's a whole can of worms, but it is a can of worms, which I think leads nicely to another question from Christian Kornatzer. Apologies if I pronounced that wrong. Any suggestions for aspiring female writers entering the sci-fi, post-apocalyptic and dystopian genres traditionally dominated by male writers, brackets, you ladies rock?
Well, thank you. Also, really good segue. Do you want me to take that one, or you want to start?
Go for it.
Oh, God. Okay. I will preface this by saying people have asked me before if my use of initials was driven by gender considerations. And for the most part, it actually wasn't. It was just that I had a career before this as an educator for like 20 years. And, at one point in that career, I was writing some scholarly papers, and I was already using my real name and, with my full name with no initials, and that was it. And back in those days, in the ancient days of like the late 90s, using initials versus your real name was actually enough to fool, Google didn't exist, but to fool the early search engines. And then natural language processing happened, and that was utterly useless. But anyway, so advice that I would have is, sure, using initials is probably helpful. I have also seen some folks using names that were sort of gender ambiguous to try and circumvent that problem as well. That's been happening since the last 2 or 3 generations of science fiction and fantasy. Off the top of my head, Andre Norton. I met a person who was shocked that Andre Norton was not a man. No, everybody knew. It was just on the shelf, people who would walk into bookstores who didn't know science fiction would pick it up and wouldn't necessarily think, oh, okay, this is by a woman and therefore I cannot buy it because cooties. The only other thing that I would suggest is just, be aware of what's going on in the industry. Be aware of, how the trend and energy with respect to sexism on that level is still happening. And you decide for yourself if you want to sort of acknowledge and cater to that sexism, or if you want to try and defy it at the possible cost of your sales. And, everyone makes that decision for themselves. There is no one true way to do it. It's really just a question of what you feel comfortable with. But you do also have to kind of watch your security. And that is probably a bigger issue these days. And we're at the last minute before we could continue this. But one of the things that I often tell students when I talk to folks at Clarion and things like that is that you may want to consider using a pen name, not necessarily, regardless of gender, using a pen name that is distinct from your own name in case, who knows, in case you start being the target of some kind of hate bomb campaign or something, or you get stalked or doxxed or whatever. There are good reasons to do all of that, and there are good reasons to kind of watch yourself in that sense. That's all I got.
I don't have any sage advice about life or career. My only sage advice will be that from a writing point of view, no matter what your considerations about publishing, no matter what your considerations about books or getting started, always write what you love. But also, in many ways, there is finally this shift starting to happen, I think, in the genre, where it's okay to write women who happen to also be people, instead of women who happen to be leather-clad, gun-wielding burdens of trauma. Women are no longer necessarily being forced to be defined by their trauma. You can just write people. And I think we're finally nearing a stage where not just our genre, but genres as a whole are beginning to conceive of the possibility that we are more than our wombs. And that's amazing and great and empowering. And please continue that. Please continue that for us. Like, rooting for you. Please, with the women human thing, because we could do with more post-apocalyptic stories where women happen to be people instead of ciphers of trauma and guns.
Yeah. We're at time, but there is a wrap-up question that was suggested to us, which I think is going to be relatively quick. Do you want to tackle that one, or I'll do it? Go for it. So what's something that you've read, watched, or listened to lately that you loved?
Very quickly, the last thing I read was genuinely, yes, and it was magnificent, and it was genuinely the last thing I read. So take that, universe.
Oh my gosh.
Watched Mitchells and the Machines. Everyone go watch Mitchells and the Machines. I laughed, cried. It's fantastic.
I'm not familiar.
Who made Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, the greatest Spider-Man film ever made in the history of the universe.
Yes.
So
I'm in. Okay, I'll check that out. And the last good thing that I saw was a Thai film called Bad Genius, which is on Netflix, and you can catch it there. But it is a film about standardized test cheating that is framed as a heist movie, and it is one of the most tense things I have seen in years, like just nail biter, and it's about multiple choice tests. So brilliantly acted, beautifully framed. The cinematography is amazing. Check it out. Okay, that's it. Okay, well, I guess we're done. So we'll wrap up here. Thank you, folks, for joining us. And we're going to call it a day. So it was wonderful, wonderful doing this with you. I am super looking forward to getting deep into your new book. And I cannot wait for the chance to do that.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. And next time you're in London, give me a bell. We'll go wandering.
Same for you in New York.
Thank
okay.
You.